Ladies and gentlemen, Path of Titans has a problem, and that problem is balance. Balance is and always has been one of the most contentious and yet important topics in video game history. Get it right, and it opens the doors for engaging, fair, and fun experiences. Get it wrong, and a game can easily become homogeneous and boring. But what about Path of Titans? In my personal opinion, Path of Titans balance has three main issues. Structure. The approach to Dino stats and roster organization is extremely messy. Dinos have huge variations in stats, particularly combat weight, which makes finding fair fights difficult outside of interspecies clashes and makes balancing overly complicated. Direction. Right now, the only method of balance in the game are stat and ability adjustments. This can work, but requires a lot of fine-tuning to get right. The game needs a new system to help guide this process. And clarity. The game does a poor job of arming players with information. Unless you go to outside sources, you'll never actually know the raw stats of the dinos you play and the damage of the attacks you deal. This subsequently makes it more difficult for players to judge who they can and can't fight, and makes the game more confusing, particularly for new players. In summary, Path of Titans balance is confusing, chaotic, and poorly communicated. It creates problems for the devs, problems for the players, and problems for the core gameplay loop. So what's the solution? Well, we need a new system that completely revamps the way the Dino roster works and supports consistent balance while also providing players with all the information they need to survive and thrive. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Like I said earlier, Path of Titans has a serious information problem. The game neglects to give players critical information, and dinosaur abilities are a fantastic example. You'll often find the game uses vague descriptions like low damage, medium damage, low fracture, high knockback, and so on. For example, the Spinosaurus's bite and claw attacks are both said to do medium damage. However, the claw attack does an extra 10 damage. But of course, the game doesn't indicate that in any way, so how is a player supposed to discern which attack is more effective? Here's another example. These are the Pachycephalosaurus's head slot abilities. They are all stated to deal low damage, but have other unique effects. So, for the Skull Bash, it deals 20 damage and dazes targets for 3 seconds. That makes sense, 20 damage is pretty low. The Charged Headbutt also deals 20 damage and does 20 fracture. Okay, so it seems that low damage has a pretty consistent value. But what about Batter? Well, this thing does a whopping 80 damage. In what world is that low damage? And then you've got the Packy's Kick, which supposedly does medium damage. So, it would make sense for it to do more damage than the low damage attack, right? Nope, it does half. Okay, I think I've made my point. These vague ability descriptions are misleading, unclear, and in some cases just wrong. Luckily, this should be a pretty easy fix. Instead of just saying things like low damage, high damage, etc., just state how much damage the attacks do. It will make things much clearer and help players understand the strengths and weaknesses of different abilities. Secondly, right now, Path of Titans only has one in-game metric to measure playable stats, and that are these bars on the character creation screen. And I think it goes without saying that this is vague and straight up inaccurate at times. Consequently, it's clear we need a better way to represent stats in-game. So, why not add a stats page to the character customization screen? For example, here's what the stats page might look like for the Styracosaurus. As you can see, I've split the stats up into a few different categories to hopefully make things a little more visually pleasing. The most important of these categories is the class stats, which contain fall resistance, group slots, and combat weight. But we'll go more in depth on this a little bit later. Overall, I think a stats page is a great idea. It gives players information they're sorely lacking and provides them a great way to see how their chosen abilities affect their stats. Before we go any further, I want to take a quick second to discuss combat weight. In case you don't know, every single creature in the game has a combat weight value that essentially determines how much damage they deal and how much damage they take. For example, let's say we have two dinos, Dino A and Dino B. Both have a combat weight of 1000 and a bite attack dealing 50 damage. If they then attack each other, they will both deal and take 50 damage. But let's say we tip the scales a bit and give Dino B an extra 1000 combat weight. Now when they attack each other, suddenly Dino A will only be dealing half the damage but taking double the damage. So when you consider that pretty much every dino in the game has a different combat weight, all of a sudden, this 50 damage attack is going to deal a different amount of damage to every single dinosaur in the game. In my opinion, this makes things needlessly complicated and certainly makes balancing more difficult. But how do we fix this? Because combat weight is an integral part of the game with a lot of abilities and mechanics hinging on it, so we can't just get rid of it. If you saw my last video, reworking the Camptosaurus, you'll remember I briefly mentioned the idea of organising dinosaurs into more well-defined weight classes. The game already does this to a lesser degree by classifying dinos by group slots, so why not flesh this out? So, introducing the class system. The class system organises playable creatures into one of the following 7 weight classes. These classes are the Critter tier, the Swift tier, the Light tier, the Balanced tier, the Heavy tier, the Sub-Apex tier, and finally, the Apex tier. Each weight class is characterised by its own set of class stats, which, like I showed earlier, is made up of 3 key stats, those being combat weight, group slots, and fall resistance. Standardizing these stats should give all creatures within a tier a general power level and ensure they are all on an even playing field. And here's what the class stats could look like for each tier. Now, which dinos go where? Well, here's where I would personally put them. So overall, what are the key benefits of the class system? Well, it puts every single creature in the game on a more even playing field. It gives players context, allowing them to know the general power level of every dino at a glance based on their tier. It massively simplifies balance, as devs no longer have to account for combat weight variations within a tier. It balances the game in a way that complements an artificial ecosystem, with the class system almost acting like a food chain. And finally, it adds a new system to the game that devs can use to create new mechanics to help balance other parts of the game, like groups. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Although there is one part of the game's balance that I have neglected to talk about, and that's groups. And that's because I think groups deserve an entire video on their own. So if you want to see that, let me know. If you've got any suggestions or changes that you would make to these systems, please let me know in the comments. But seriously, if you're still watching by this point, thanks so much for sticking around, and I'll catch you in the next one. And I promise the next one won't take 8 months. Probably. Alright, see ya.